Colonel Nathan Briggs grabbed Claire Donovan's personnel file and hurled it directly into her face. Papers exploded across the grinder. Every candidate froze. "Pick it up." His voice was iron. "Every single page. On your knees." Claire didn't move. "I said on your knees, Sergeant." She looked at him, not with defiance, not with fear, with something far more dangerous than either: complete stillness. Briggs leaned in until his face was inches from hers and whispered so only she could hear, "I will break you before this week is over. That is a promise, Boamu." He had no idea that promise would cost him everything he believed. If this story moves you, subscribe, hit the bell, and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this shot travels. She arrived on a Tuesday morning, which felt wrong somehow. Tuesdays were ordinary. Tuesdays were grocery lists and dentist appointments and conference calls that could have been emails. Tuesdays were not the kind of day a person showed up to one of the most demanding military sniper programs in the history of the United States Armed Forces. But Sergeant First Class Claire Donovan had never done anything on the world's schedule. She stepped off the transport vehicle at Naval Amphibious Base Coronado with one duffel bag, a rifle case she'd carried since Afghanistan, and the kind of quiet that made people nervous. Not the quiet of someone who had nothing to say. The quiet of someone who had already decided most conversations weren't worth having. She was 34 years old, 5'7", 142 pounds of lean muscle and scar tissue, and something harder than either of those things, something that lived behind her eyes and didn't have a proper name in any military manual ever written. The other candidates were already assembled on the grinder when she walked up. 23 men, every single one of them elite, Rangers, Recon Marines, Special Forces, veteran soldiers who had been handpicked from the top percentile of the top percentile. Men who had already survived things that would have ended most people. And every single one of them looked at Claire Donovan the same way. Not with hostility, not exactly, more like confusion. The kind of confusion that comes before a judgment forms. A man named Sergeant First Class Marcus Webb, broad-shouldered, square-jawed, the kind of soldier who made recruiting posters look realistic, leaned over to the man beside him and said, just loud enough, "Command really doing this?" The man beside him, a ranger named Delgado, didn't answer, but he didn't disagree either. Claire heard it. She always heard things. Her father had taught her that hearing wasn't about volume, it was about attention. And Claire Donovan had been paying attention to the world since she was 9 years old, crouched in a deer blind in the Rocky Mountains of Colorado, learning that silence was not the absence of information. Silence was the purest form of it. She set her duffel down and stood at attention with everyone else. She did not introduce herself. She did not smile. She did not look around for allies. She simply waited. Because patience, her father had told her once, is not weakness wearing a polite face. Patience is the discipline to let the world show you what it actually is before you respond to what you think it is. 2 minutes later, Colonel Nathan Briggs walked out of the building, and the entire grinder changed temperature. It wasn't theatrical. He didn't stride or swagger or make any kind of production of his entrance. He simply appeared a man of 51 iron gray hair, cut close to his skull, wearing a uniform that looked like it had been pressed by someone who took pressing seriously. He walked the way soldiers walk when they've stopped trying to intimidate people because they no longer need to. The intimidation just travels ahead of them. He stopped in front of the assembled class and looked them over slowly. His eyes moved from left to right, paused on a few faces, moved on, and then they landed on Claire. They stayed there for 3 full seconds. In the military, 3 seconds is a long time to hold eye contact with someone you outrank by a significant margin. It's not a look, it's a statement. Claire met it directly. She had made a decision years ago that she would never drop her eyes first. Not to anyone, not because of pride. Pride was a luxury she couldn't afford, but because the moment you looked away was the moment the other person knew they had a lever they could pull. Briggs looked away first. But it wasn't the look away of a man who'd backed down. It was the look away of a man who had just confirmed something he already suspected and didn't particularly like what he'd confirmed. He began his opening address. The SEAL Advanced Sniper course, he told them, had a completion rate of 41%. He said that without drama as a statement of fact, the way a weather forecast mentions rain, 41% of the men standing on that grinder would not finish. Some would quit. Some would be cut for performance. A few, and he paused here in a way that communicated the weight of a few would suffer injuries that ended careers. This program, Briggs said, does not grade on curves. It does not make accommodations. It does not care about your prior record, your commendations, or what your commanding officer wrote about you in the recommendation that got you here. He walked slowly along the front row as he spoke. The only thing this program cares about is whether, when everything is stripped away, you can do the one thing that matters. You can wait. You can think. And then you can put a bullet exactly where it needs to go under conditions that are trying to make that impossible. He stopped. He was standing in front of Claire. Is that understood, Sergeant Donovan? The way he said her name was precise, like a scalpel. Like he'd practiced the exact amount of emphasis to place on it to make it feel like a question that wasn't really a question. Yes, sir, Claire said, flat, clean, no color in it. He held her gaze for another beat. Then he turned and walked back to the center of the formation. Good, he said, because starting tomorrow, I'm going to show every one of you exactly what impossible actually looks like. He meant it for the class. But they all knew, every one of those 23 men, and Claire herself, that he had said it for her. That night, Claire sat alone on the edge of her rack in the barracks and cleaned her rifle. It was a ritual. Every component handled in the same order, every surface attended to with the same deliberate care. Her father had taught her that a sniper's relationship with their rifle was not like a carpenter's relationship with a hammer. A hammer was a tool. A rifle, at the distance and precision a true sniper operates at, was more like a musical instrument. You had to know it, not just know how it worked, know its personality. Know what it did under cold, under heat, under humidity. Know the way it settled into your shoulder. Know the tiny variations in its trigger pull that changed depending on how long you'd been holding position. Her father's name was Robert Donovan, Staff Sergeant, United States Marine Corps, retired, scout sniper with 2 tours in Vietnam, and a third in a place the government didn't put on the official record. He was 60-70 years old when he died, sitting in his favorite chair by the window of his farmhouse in Montrose, Colorado, watching the mountains the way he had watched them every evening for 30 years. She had been holding his hand. He didn't say much at the end. He wasn't a man who had ever said much. But in the last hour, he had looked at her and said in a voice that was mostly breath by then, "You already know everything I taught you. Now you just have to trust it." She had promised him 3 things that night, written on a piece of paper in her own handwriting, tucked into the inner pocket of his Bible where it still lived. She cleaned the bolt assembly and set it carefully on the cloth beside her. Serve with honor. Never quit. Become the sniper they said you couldn't be. She didn't read the list. She didn't need to. She knew what it said the same way she knew her own heartbeat. She just kept cleaning. The first week of training was designed to do one thing: find out where a candidate broke. It was not subtle about this. There was no pretense of gradual escalation. They started at maximum and then found ways to exceed it. Sleep deprivation. Physical exhaustion layered on top of cognitive testing, layered on top of field exercises that began before dawn and ended after midnight. Instructors screaming contradictory instructions to see how candidates responded to chaos. Equipment checks at 3 in the morning. 5-mile runs followed immediately by precision shooting exercises that required heart rate below 60. Most of the candidates had expected hard. Hard they could manage. What broke people wasn't the hard, it was the relentlessness. The fact that there was no moment, not one, where the environment gave you permission to exhale. By the end of day 3, 2 men had voluntarily withdrawn. One had gone to the medical bay with a stress fracture in his foot. Another had simply stopped moving during a night land navigation exercise and sat down on a rock and refused to get up. The instructors had stood around him for a while, said nothing, and eventually one of them had walked away and come back with the paperwork. Claire absorbed all of it. She was not unaffected. She'd have been lying to claim otherwise. She was exhausted in a way that lived below the muscle level, down in the bones and the connective tissue, in some tissue that didn't have a name in anatomy textbooks. She was cold in the California mornings. In a way, the cold didn't entirely leave during the day. She was running on less sleep than her body wanted and more coffee than her body needed. But she had a mechanism that other candidates didn't have, or at least didn't have in the same form. When everything external became unbearable, she went somewhere internal. Her father had called it the quiet room. Not a real place. A mental space. The part of your mind that the noise couldn't reach if you'd built the walls thick enough. He'd built his in Vietnam in the bush, lying motionless for hours in triple canopy jungle, with insects crawling across his face, waiting for a shot that sometimes came and sometimes didn't. The body will do almost anything you ask it to do, he'd told her once when she was maybe 12 and complaining about the cold during a November hunting trip. The body is remarkably cooperative. It's the mind that quits first. So you build a room in your mind that quitting can't get into, and when things get bad, you go there. She went there a lot in week 1. What she noticed from inside that quiet room was something the other candidates were too exhausted to notice the pattern. Every instructor had a pattern, a rhythm to how they applied pressure, a timing to their escalations, a logic even when the logic was illogical, to when they pushed hardest and when they backed off. Colonel Briggs had a pattern too. He was hardest on her, not randomly but specifically, in the moments when she was performing at her best, when she finished first in an exercise or solved a problem faster than anyone else. The pressure didn't ease, it increased, as if her excellence was the thing that most needed to be corrected. She stored that observation quietly. She didn't know yet what to do with it, but she filed it away with the same care she filed everything else: her father's lessons, the morning wind readings, the way the target moved at 800 meters when a thermal hit it from the south. In week 2, she met Tyler Reed. He was 22 years old, from a small town in eastern Tennessee called Surgoinsville, which was the kind of name that sounded made up until you realized places like that were more real than most places with impressive names. He was a ranger, and he was technically excellent. His scores on the flat range were outstanding. His physical conditioning was solid, and he had an instinctive understanding of fieldcraft that the instructors from conventional backgrounds had to be taught. But Tyler Reed had a problem. He fell apart under observation. The moment an instructor was watching him, something in his mechanics shifted, his breathing changed. His trigger pull went from smooth to anxious. His time slipped. His groups opened up. It was like watching a man who could play piano beautifully alone in a room suddenly lose access to his own hands the moment an audience sat down. Claire recognized it immediately. She'd had the same problem at 22 in her first advanced marksmanship course. Her instructor, then a crusty master sergeant named Plunkett, who smelled permanently of chewing tobacco and diesel fuel, had looked at her groups on day 3 and said with characteristic gentleness, "You shoot like someone who's afraid to be wrong." She'd wanted to argue, but he was right. She found Tyler on this range at dusk after the formal training day was over, running dry fire drills by himself in the fading light. "Your breathing's wrong," she said. He looked up. He was visibly startled. She'd moved across the range without making noise, a habit so ingrained she didn't notice she was doing it anymore. "Ma'am, when you know someone's watching, you try to control your breathing instead of letting it happen. You're fighting your own body. Your groups tell on you every time." He stared at her. He didn't know how to take this, a woman he'd spent the last 2 weeks secretly uncertain about offering him instruction that landed with the precision of someone who knew exactly what she was talking about. "How do you—" "Because I did it for 2 years before someone pointed it out," she said. "Your father a hunter." He blinked. "Yes, ma'am. How did you know?" "Because you hold your breath before the shot the way deer hunters do. It's instinct. You learned it right for short range. But a sniper doesn't hold. A sniper finds the natural respiratory pause between exhale and inhale and fires inside that window. There's a difference between controlling your breath and fighting your breath." Tyler looked down at his rifle. "Why are you telling me this?" he asked. It was a fair question. In a course where 41% of candidates didn't finish, helping someone else survive was by some calculus working against your own interests. "Because that's not how I was raised," she said simply. She left him there to practice. The next day, his groups tightened by 40%. His instructor, a chief petty officer named Rawlins, noticed it immediately and said nothing, but his expression said something. Word traveled the way word always travels in small, high-stress groups, quietly, quickly, and with more accuracy than the people it traveled about would have preferred. By the end of week 2, something in the dynamic of the class had begun very subtly, almost imperceptibly, to shift. The problem began on a Thursday. It began with her scope. Claire noticed it during the morning long-range exercise, a 1,000-meter engagement course that required confirming 6 targets in sequence, moving between shooting positions. Her first shot was 2 inches high and 4 inches left at 1,000 meters. At that distance, 2 inches and 4 inches represented a miss. She adjusted, confirmed a hit, moved on. but the adjustment didn't track. She adjusted again. The error persisted but differently. Not consistently, it varied, which meant it wasn't the wind. A wind error is consistent in direction, predictable in magnitude. This was random. Random within a range, but random. A scope doesn't develop random error on its own. Scopes develop consistent errors, a zero shift from impact, a degraded reticle. Random error meant a mechanical problem, a loose element, something deliberately interfered with. She completed the exercise without showing anything on her face. She confirmed 4 of 6 targets still passing. But she was one of 2 candidates that day who didn't go clean, and she knew with a cold certainty that settled into her chest like a stone that this was not an accident. That evening, she stripped the scope, completely examined every component, found a hair-thin shim placed between the elevation turret and the adjustment body. It was so small, so precisely placed, that a visual inspection wouldn't catch it. You had to disassemble, and you had to know what you were looking for. She held the shim up to the light for a long time. Then she put it in the small, zippered pocket of her kit, reassembled the scope, re-zeroed it at last light, and went to dinner. She told no one, not because she didn't know who had done it. She had a strong enough suspicion to constitute a conviction. But accusations without proof in a command environment that was already looking for reasons to question her were weapons that fired backward. Her father had told her, "Just let them see the wound," not because wounds are shameful, but because predators are attracted to blood. So she bled privately, and she waited. The score adjustment happened in week 3. She finished the unknown distance stalking exercise with the highest raw performance score in the class, a composite of approach time, concealment, position, establishment, and hit probability at ranges that hadn't been disclosed in advance. She knew her score. She'd run the math herself, a habit from years of keeping her own records in parallel with official ones. When the posted scores appeared, hers was 7th. The methodology note beside her entry cited technique deviations that hadn't been cited on anyone else's scorecard and weren't referenced in any rubric document she had access to. Marcus Webb, who had finished the exercise after her and hit 1 fewer target, was listed 3rd. She stared at the board for a long time. Webb came and stood beside her. He looked at the board, then at her, and for a moment something crossed his face that wasn't smugness. Something more complicated. "That's not right," he said quietly. She looked at him. "I was behind you on approach," he said. "I watched your stalk. It was clean. Cleaner than mine." He paused. "I'm not saying this because I feel sorry for you. I'm saying it because it's what I saw." It was perhaps the most honest thing anyone had said to her since she'd arrived. "I know," she said. "What are you going to do?" She looked at the board for another moment. "Keep shooting," she said. She filed a formal discrepancy notice through the chain of command, not because she expected it to change the score, but because she understood that documentation was its own kind of ammunition. A paper trail was a record. Records had a way of mattering later in ways you couldn't always predict when you were making them. 2 days later, she was summoned to Colonel Briggs' office. It was a small room that held only what was necessary: a desk, 2 chairs, a window that faced the range. He was standing when she entered, looking at something on the wall that turned out to be nothing. A blank wall. He was using the act of looking at it as a way to finish a thought before he had to deal with her. She stood at attention and waited. He turned around. "Sergeant Donovan, you filed a discrepancy notice." "Yes, sir." "You're aware that I review all performance documentation in this course?" "Yes, sir." He sat down behind his desk. He laced his fingers together and looked at her with an expression she had learned in 3 weeks to read fairly accurately. It was the expression he used when he was about to say something he'd decided on before she walked in. "I've reviewed the scoring for the unknown distance exercise. The methodology was applied consistently." A pause. "Some technique deviations are not reflected in raw data. Experienced evaluators notice things that aren't captured in scores." "With respect, sir," Claire said, "I'd like to know specifically what technique deviations were observed and whether those deviations were documented in real time or after the composite score was calculated." Something flickered across his face. Not anger. Anger she would have expected. This was something quieter and more complicated than anger. "Are you accusing me of something, Sergeant?" She held his gaze, steady, no heat in it. "No, sir. I'm asking a procedural question. I'm asking what was observed and when it was documented. Those seem like reasonable questions for a candidate to ask about a score that affected her standing. Silence. The kind of silence that has weight. You're a long way, Briggs said finally, from where you think you are. It wasn't a threat exactly. It was a statement with the shape of a threat. Yes, sir, Claire said. I'm aware of that. He dismissed her. She walked out of the building into the cool evening air and stood for a moment with the salt smell of the Pacific coming off the bay. She let herself feel just briefly, just for 30 seconds, the anger she hadn't shown him, the exhaustion, the profound, bone-deep frustration of being the best and having to fight for the right to be acknowledged as adequate. 30 seconds. Then she went back to the barracks and cleaned her rifle. There was still so much range left to cover. And somewhere in the Nevada mountains, a steel target sat at 1,400 meters between two canyon walls waiting. It had been waiting for 32 years. It was going to wait a little longer. The discrepancy notice Claire filed didn't disappear. It sat in the system like a splinter too small to pull out cleanly, too irritating to ignore. And Colonel Briggs, whatever else he was not a man who ignored splinters. 3 days after their meeting in his office, he called a full-class assembly at 5 in the morning. Not a training evolution, not a physical evolution, an assembly. Candidates standing in formation in the dark breath, visible in the cold air, nobody knowing why they were there. Briggs walked out and stood in front of them for a long moment without speaking. Then he said, "We have a candidate in this program who filed a formal complaint about her scores." He didn't say Claire's name. He didn't have to. Every eye that wasn't already trained forward slid toward her for exactly 1 second before snapping back. In 22 years of running sniper programs, Briggs continued, his voice carrying the kind of flatness that was somehow worse than shouting, "I have never had a candidate question the integrity of this course's evaluation process. Never. Not once." He began walking along the front of the formation. "You want to know why? Because the candidates who get selected for this program understand something fundamental. This course doesn't owe you accuracy. It owes you truth. And the truth is that some people standing on this grinder right now do not have what it takes. And no amount of paperwork changes that." He stopped, right in front of Claire. "Are we clear, Sergeant Donovan?" "Yes, sir," she said. Her voice was completely level. Briggs held the pause for 3 full seconds, long enough that it became a kind of theater, a performance for the 23 men watching, and then he walked away. What he didn't see, because he had already turned his back, was Marcus Webb. Webb, who was standing 2 positions to Claire's left, looked at the back of Briggs' retreating figure, and then looked at Claire with an expression that had traveled a very long distance in 3 weeks. It was not sympathy. Marcus Webb was not built for sympathy, omnisciency. It was something closer to recognition. The look of a man who had just watched something unjust happen and knew it, even if he didn't yet know what to do with that knowledge. Claire felt his look, but did not return it. She kept her eyes forward. She kept her face still. She filed that moment away beside all the others and waited for the formation to break. Training resumed at 0600. The Week 4 curriculum centered on what the instructors called environmental integration, the art of reading everything around you and folding that information into your shot. Wind, obviously, but also temperature gradients, mirage, light angle, the way certain terrain features created predictable air currents at predictable times of day, the way a target's behavior changed based on conditions the shooter couldn't directly observe. It was, in Claire's estimation, the most beautiful part of the curriculum, because this was where raw mechanical skill stopped being enough. You could have perfect trigger control, perfect breathing, perfect position, and still miss if you didn't understand what the air was doing between you and your target. And the air she had learned from her father before she ever touched a military-issue rifle was never random. It just required a different kind of listening. The primary instructor for the environmental block was a chief petty officer named Hendricks. He was not like Rawlins, who was loud and aggressive and used pressure the way a blunt instrument gets used. Hendricks was quiet and methodical, the kind of instructor who taught by asking questions that led you to discover the answer yourself rather than handing it to you. On the second day of the block, he stood at the head of a group of 12 candidates on a hillside overlooking a valley and asked, without preamble, "What's the wind doing at the target?" There were flags at the firing line, and flags at 500 meters, and flags at 800. But the target was at 9:50. No flag at the target. 7 candidates gave answers based on the visible flags, interpolated readings, reasonable extrapolations. Tyler Reed said nothing. He was watching the grass in the valley. Claire said nothing either. She was watching something else entirely, a bird, a small falcon hovering at target distance, its wings making micro-adjustments that told a story the flags couldn't. Hendricks waited. Then he said, "Donovan, what are you watching?" "The bird, Chief." "Why the bird?" "Because it's hovering at target distance, and its wings are telling me what the wind is doing at that exact point in space more accurately than the flags are. The flags are 7 feet off the ground. Wind at that height isn't necessarily wind at the height of a center mass target. The bird is adjusting to wind at approximately chest height for a standing target. Right now, it's compensating about 8 degrees into a right-to-left crosswind that's stronger than the flags are showing, which means the valley is funneling air in a way that's not reflected in the surface readings." Silence. Hendricks looked at her for a long moment. "What's your correction?" he asked. She gave him the number. He nodded once, not enthusiastically, just once. The nod of a man who had received a correct answer and was acknowledging it with the exact amount of acknowledgement it deserved. "Everyone else," he said to the group, "remember this? Wind flags are a starting point. They are not the answer." That night in the barracks, Tyler came and sat on the footlocker across from Claire's rack. He was quiet for a while in the way young soldiers are quiet when they're working up to saying something they're not sure they have the right to say. "Can I ask you something?" he finally said. "You're going to," she said without looking up from the cleaning rod she was running through the barrel. "How did you know to look at the bird?" She was quiet for a moment. "My dad," she said. "He used to say that animals were reading the environment before you got there, and they'll keep reading it after you leave. They don't have the option of getting it wrong. So if you want to know what something is actually doing, watch something that depends on knowing." Tyler was quiet, processing that. "He sounds like he was something else," Tyler said carefully. "He was," Claire said, and her voice for just one word, for just one syllable, dropped into something softer than the rest of her. Then it came back. "He was a Marine Scout sniper, Vietnam era. He used to say that he learned more about sniping from sitting in a deer blind with me at age 8 than from any formal instruction he ever received." "Did he know you were going to do this program?" She set the cleaning rod down. "He made me promise," she said. Not to make him proud. He wasn't that kind of man. He made me promise because he believed I could do it, and he didn't want me to not do it because other people didn't believe I could." She picked the rod back up. "He was right about the second part," she said quietly. "The jury's still out on the first." Tyler nodded slowly. He started to stand, then stopped. "For what it's worth," he said, "every guy in this class knows you're the best shooter here. Even the ones who won't say it, especially the ones who won't say it." She looked at him then, directly. "That's kind," she said. "It's also not the problem." He didn't fully understand that yet, but he would. The problem revealed itself in week 5 in a way that was so elegant in its cruelty that Claire almost had to admire the precision of it. Week 5 introduced what the program called the dual stress protocol, simultaneous physical and psychological pressure applied to test decision-making under compound degradation. Candidates ran a modified obstacle course carrying full kit, then transitioned immediately to a timed precision engagement exercise. Then were pulled into individual interviews with a panel of instructors who asked rapid-fire questions about the exercise they just completed while monitoring physiological stress indicators. The protocol was legitimate. It was a genuine training tool with a real purpose. Snipers operated in conditions where physical and mental stress compounded each other, and the course needed to identify which candidates fell apart under that compounding and which ones didn't. But the implementation for Claire had a modification. She found out about the modification the way she found out about most things, by noticing the detail that didn't fit. During the physical phase, she was routed through a section of the course that the other candidates weren't. She didn't realize it until she was already in it, a mud pit crossing that added approximately 4 minutes to her time and cost her a position in the sequence that mattered for the transition to the firing line. She got to the firing line late. The exercise clock was already running. She set up as fast as she had ever set up in her life. Breathing controlled position, established scope, cleared and engaged 5 of 6 targets in the time remaining. The 6th target was still rotating into position when the clock ended. 5 of 6, under deliberately compromised conditions. Still a passing score, but not the score she would have posted. In the instructor interview that followed, she was asked by a lieutenant commander named Forsyth, a man she hadn't dealt with before, which itself was notable to describe her decision-making process during the engagement. She described it accurately and completely. Forsyth nodded, made notes, and then said with the careful casualness of a man who had rehearsed the moment, "Do you think your result reflected your actual capability today?" She looked at him. "No," she said. "Why not?" "Because my route through the physical phase was different from the other candidates' routes in a way that affected my transition time, which reduced my available engagement time, which reduced my score." Forsyth set his pen down. "That's a significant allegation, Sergeant." "It's an observation," she said. "I'm happy to walk you through the route differences. I memorized both." A pause. "Both?" Forsyth said. "I paid attention during the course walkthrough this morning," she said. "I noticed my route marker was different from the standard route. I memorized both routes so I'd have a reference point if the difference mattered." Another pause, longer this time. "I see," Forsyth said. He closed his notebook. The score for the dual stress protocol was posted that evening. Claire's was accurate, 5 of 6, with a notation that her transition time exceeded the standard window. No mention of route variance, no explanation of why her route differed from the standard. But the following morning, something happened that nobody had predicted. Webb came to her. Not quietly, not privately. He came to her in the common area of the barracks where 8 other candidates were present and said in a voice that was deliberately not quiet, "I want to show you something." He held up his phone. On it was a photograph he had taken during the course walkthrough the previous morning before the protocol began. It showed the route markers clearly. 2 different paths, one for everyone else, one that led through the mud pit. "I thought it was a mistake," he said. "I took this to ask you about it because I figured you'd notice too. Then the exercise happened, and I figured—" He paused. "I figured some things out." The 8 candidates in the room were very still. Claire looked at the photograph, then at Webb. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. Webb was quiet for a beat, then roughly like the words were objects, he was moving that were heavier than he expected. "Because I've been trying to figure out if you deserve to be here since day one, and I've had my answer for a while now, I just didn't do anything about it." He put the phone in his pocket. "I'm going to Rollins," he said. "You can come or not. That's your choice. But I'm going." He turned and walked out of the barracks. Claire stood there for a moment. 7 of the 8 candidates in the room were watching her. The 8th, a ranger named Kowalski, who had barely said 10 words to her, the entire program, stood up, picked up his coffee, and said to no one in particular, "I'll go too," and walked out after Webb. What happened in Chief Rollins' office that afternoon was not a dramatic confrontation. There was no shouting, no moment of theatrical revelation. Rollins looked at Webb's photograph. He looked at it for a long time. He asked a few questions. He took the phone and photographed the photograph with his own phone. He thanked them and told them to return to the barracks. His expression as they left was the expression of a man who was doing arithmetic in his head and not liking the sum. Colonel Briggs called Claire to his office that evening. She had expected anger. She had braced for it, not visibly but internally, the way you brace for a wave you can see coming from a distance. What she got was not anger. Briggs was sitting behind his desk when she entered, and he looked for the first time since she had known him like a man who was tired. Not physically tired, the other kind. The kind that comes from carrying something heavy for too long without setting it down. He didn't speak for almost 30 seconds after she entered. Then he said, "The route variance has been classified as an administrative error." She said nothing. "Your dual stress protocol score will be recalculated based on the standard transition window." He paused. "The adjusted score will reflect a full 6 of 6 engagement." She said nothing. He looked at her then. For the first time in 5 weeks, he looked at her not the way he looked at a problem, not the way he looked at something he needed to manage, but the way one person sometimes looks at another person when the wall between them has developed a crack neither of them intended. "Is there anything you want to say?" he asked. She held his gaze. "No, sir," she said. He nodded slowly, as if that answer, that specific, deliberate, controlled answer, confirmed something for him. "Dismissed," he said. She walked out. In the hallway outside his office, she stopped and put her back against the wall and closed her eyes for exactly 10 seconds. Just 10. And in those 10 seconds, she allowed herself to feel the full weight of what 5 weeks had cost her, not in scores, not in standing, but in the pure grinding expenditure of energy required to remain unbroken when the pressure was designed specifically to break her. 10 seconds. Then she opened her eyes and walked back to the barracks because there were still 3 weeks of training remaining and a still target at 1,400 meters in a Nevada canyon that had been waiting 32 years for someone who could read the wind the way her father had taught her to. And she was almost there. The last 3 days of week 5 produced something unexpected, a shift in the air of the class that was as real and as measurable as any win Claire had ever read. It started with small things. Candidates who had previously moved away from her position at the mess table began sitting near her. Questions that would previously have been directed to Rollins or Hendricks started being directed quietly to her. A recon Marine named Park, who had spent 5 weeks maintaining a studied neutrality that was its own kind of statement, came to her before a night stalking exercise and said, "What would you look for in the approach? You don't have to answer." She answered. He listened the way serious people listen, not just with his ears, but with something more fundamental, the part of a person that knows the difference between information they can use and information they can't. He completed the stalking exercise with the best time in the class. Afterward, he found her and said simply, "It worked." "I know," she said. "How did you know before you knew?" he asked. She thought about it for a moment. "Because my father taught me the same thing," she said, "and it worked for me too." Park nodded slowly. "Where's your father now?" he asked. She looked at him for a moment. "He's why I'm here," she said, which was true in every way that mattered. The class that had arrived at Coronado as 24 individuals had become, by the end of week 5, something that wasn't quite a unit and wasn't quite a team and wasn't quite a family, but had elements of all three, the messy, imperfect, hard-won solidarity of people who have been through something together that most people never go through. The kind of connection that doesn't require conversation because it was built from shared suffering and shared witness. And at the center of it, acknowledged now by everyone, even if acknowledged silently by some, was Claire Donovan. She hadn't asked for it. She hadn't campaigned for it. She had simply done what she'd come to do, absorbed what had been thrown at her, helped the people she could help, and refused to disappear. Briggs watched all of it from a distance. He watched it with an expression that only Rollins was ever close enough to see, and Rollins, who had served with Briggs for 11 years and knew him better than most people knew, their closest friends saw something in that expression that he hadn't seen on Briggs's face in a very long time. Something that looked from a certain angle like a man beginning to question a story he had been telling himself for years. Rollins didn't say anything about it. He stored it away. He was a patient man who had learned from a long career in difficult environments that some things revealed themselves in their own time and couldn't be hurried. The transport to Nevada was scheduled for early the following Monday. The impossible canyon waited, and somewhere between who Claire Donovan had been when she arrived and who she was now, the distance between her and Ghost Target 7 had stopped being a matter of miles. The transport bus pulled out of Coronado at 4 in the morning. 17 candidates, that was what remained. 7 men had left the program in the 5 weeks prior, 2 voluntary withdrawals, 2 medical drops, 2 performance cuts, and 1 candidate who had simply stopped responding to anything and was quietly removed before anyone had to make it official. 17 from 24. And every one of the 17 sitting on that bus knew exactly what the next 4 days meant. Nevada, the final qualification range, and Ghost Target 7. Nobody talked much on the ride. That was normal. Soldiers in the final approach to something significant tend to go quiet in a particular way, the way people go quiet before a verdict gets read. The energy on that bus was compressed and dense, and sitting just below the surface of every face. Claire sat near the window in the 3rd row. She had her eyes open, but she wasn't watching the highway disappear into the dark. She was doing what she always did in the hours before something mattered. She was listening inward, running through everything her father had taught her. Not as a checklist, more like a conversation. The way you talk to someone who isn't in the room anymore, but whose voice you still know well enough to hear clearly. Tyler Reed was sitting across the aisle from her. He hadn't slept either. At some point, maybe 2 hours into the ride, he said quietly without looking at her, "You nervous?" "Yes," she said. He seemed surprised by the honesty of it. "Me too," he said. "Good," she said. "Nervous means you understand what's at stake. People who aren't nervous before something like this either don't care or don't understand. Neither of those is who you want next to you." He was quiet for a moment. "My hands are shaking," he said very quietly, like it was a confession. "They'll stop when you start shooting," she said. "They always do. The body knows what to do. It's the waiting that makes it shake." He nodded. He didn't say anything else. But some of the tension went out of his shoulders, and that was enough. 3 rows back, Marcus Webb sat with his arms crossed and his eyes closed. And if you didn't know better, you'd think he was sleeping. But Kowalski, who was sitting beside him, had been around Webb long enough to know that when Webb's jaw was set at that particular angle, he was thinking very hard about something, and the closed eyes were just there to give him privacy while he did it. Colonel Briggs was in the front vehicle, separate from the candidates, which was standard procedure and also, on this particular morning, felt meaningful in a way that was hard to articulate. They arrived at the Nevada facility as the sky was beginning to think about becoming light without committing to it yet. The facility itself was operational, and nothing more functional structures arranged that stretched into a canyon system that the mountains had built over millions of years without any concern for what humans would eventually try to do with it. The air at this elevation had a different quality than coastal air, thinner, drier, and cold in the particular way that high desert is cold, not wet, cold, not soft cold, but the kind of cold that is honest about what it is. The first day was acclimation and qualification prelims. Long-range cold bore confirmation at 800 meters, then 1,000, then 1,250. Environmental assessment exercises. Unknown distance target engagement across varied terrain. The instructors watched and took notes and said very little. Claire shot clean, every evolution. 800 meters, 1 round confirmed hit. 1,000 meters, 1 round confirmed hit. 1,250, 1 round confirmed hit. Dead center, the kind of hit that makes experienced shooters go quiet for a second before they write the number down. Rollins was behind the spotting scope for her 1,250 shot. When the round connected, he was quiet for exactly 2 seconds, and then he said flatly, "Mark, center, good shot, Donovan." He said it the same way he would have said it to anyone. But he didn't move the scope right away, and Claire, who was already back in her position, running her next natural respiratory cycle, could see in her peripheral vision that he was still looking at the target. She filed that away. The second day was when Ghost Target 7 entered the conversation in a real way for the first time. Briggs gathered the full class at the top of the primary canyon after the morning's evolution and stood with his back to the valley below. He had a way of positioning himself against geography that was almost theatrical. The canyon behind him, the sky above 17 candidates in front, wind cutting across everything. He did it without appearing to think about it, which meant he'd been doing it long enough that it was instinct. "Before we begin the afternoon block," he said, "I want to talk about what you're going to see tomorrow." He paused. Ghost Target 7 has been in this canyon for 32 years. It was installed by the range's original design team as a theoretical maximum engagement, a target placed at conditions that represented the edge of what physics and human skill combined could reasonably achieve. 1,400 meters, canyon influence on wind, thermal variables that change with time of day, a target profile that presents a realistic engagement surface but leaves no margin for error. He let that sit for a moment. In 32 years, he said, this course has cycled through over 800 candidates. Every qualifying class attempts Ghost Target 7 on the final day. Every qualifying class walks away without a confirmed hit. He looked across the 17 faces in front of him. This is not a criticism of any of those candidates. Those were exceptional shooters. Many of them are serving in the field right now, doing things that most people in this country will never hear about. The shot is not impossible because those men were inadequate. The shot is impossible because the conditions of this canyon create a wind environment that cannot be fully accounted for by standard calculation methodology. He paused again. Then almost as an afterthought, but it was not an afterthought. Nothing, Briggs said, was an afterthought. He looked directly at Claire. Physics says so, he said, just that, just those 3 words. And then he moved on to the afternoon schedule. But the way he looked at her when he said it, that look was not a general statement about physics. That look was a message. And every candidate by standing in that formation received the same message at the same frequency, whether Briggs intended them to or not. Tyler, walking beside Claire back down toward the range, said in a very low voice, "That was directed at you." "I know," she said. "Does it bother you?" She thought about it honestly. "It lights something," she said. "Whether that's useful or not depends on what I do with it." Tyler nodded slowly, working that out. Webb fell into step on her other side without announcing himself. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then, he's setting the narrative before tomorrow. Whatever happens tomorrow, he wants the story already written. "I know," Claire said again. "So what's your story?" Webb asked. She looked forward. "Same one it's always been," she said. That evening, after the day's formal training ended, Claire went back to the canyon alone. Not to the firing line, not to where the target was. She went to the rim of the canyon at a point above and between the firing position and the target, and she sat down on the rock and she watched. She watched for 2 hours. The wind in the canyon did not behave the way wind in open terrain behaved. She had known this theoretically from the briefing materials, but theory was different from observation. The canyon walls created compression and deflection patterns that interacted with each other in ways that were genuinely complex. On the surface from the firing line, the flag showed one thing. From above, watching the actual air movement indicated by dust by plant movement. By the behavior of the insects that lived in the rock faces, she could see that the surface readings were an approximation of something more complicated. Her father had told her once, sitting on a ridge in Colorado watching a valley below, that the best thing a sniper could do was watch the same piece of ground in different light at different times of day because the ground didn't change, but your understanding of it did. She watched, and at 47 minutes into her watch, she saw it for the first time. A pattern in the dust along the canyon floor. A rotation, not random, not linear rotational. The air in the lower canyon was forming a thermal pocket that cycled. She watched it cycle once and started counting. Watched it cycle again. 11 seconds. The cycle was 11 seconds. She counted it 6 more times, 11 seconds. 11 seconds? 11 seconds? A variation of a half second either way, which was within the margin of air temperature fluctuation, which was itself predictable based on time of day. This was not chaos. This was not the random canyon influence that Briggs had described as physics-defying. This was a pattern, hidden yes, subtle yes, but a pattern, and patterns had solutions. Her heart rate went up by about 10 beats per minute, and then deliberately she brought it back down. Not yet. She had not solved anything yet. She had identified a variable. Identifying a variable was not the same as accounting for it. She needed to understand what the thermal pocket did to a bullet traveling through it at 1,400 meters. She needed to understand the bullet's time of flight. She needed to understand at what point in the 11-second cycle the air created a condition that could be used rather than worked against. She sat on the rim of the canyon and did the math in her head for another hour. When she walked back to the barracks, it was full dark, and the temperature had dropped 20 degrees from the afternoon high. Rollins was sitting outside the operations building, smoking a cigarette. He was the only instructor she'd met who still smoked, and he did it with the unapologetic dedication of a man who had made his peace with his vices, and he watched her walk in from the direction of the canyon with an expression she couldn't fully read in the dark. He didn't ask where she'd been. He just watched her walk past and finished his cigarette. The third day was the formal qualification block. The final evaluations before Ghost Target 7, long-range precision stalking, unknown distance engagement, and a scenario exercise that compressed everything into a simulated operational context. Claire finished first overall, not by a small margin, by a margin that made the numbers in the scoring log look to anyone reviewing them like there had been a data entry error. Rollins checked them twice, then he called Hendricks over and had him check them independently. Hendricks looked at the numbers, looked at Rollins, and said nothing. What happened next was the kind of thing that spreads through a small group the way fire spreads through dry brush. Fast total and changing everything it touches. Park told Kowalski. Kowalski told 2 Rangers. The Rangers told Webb. Webb stood in the middle of the barracks and said to anyone within earshot, which was everyone, "She finished first overall by 11 points, 11. Someone nobody admitted to it later, but it happened, started a slow clap. It lasted maybe 4 seconds before discipline reasserted itself, and everyone remembered they were in a military training environment. But 4 seconds was enough. 4 seconds was a declaration. Tyler sat on his rack with a grin on his face that he wasn't trying to hide. Claire, for her part, was cleaning her rifle. She heard all of it. She said nothing. But her hands, just for a moment, were very still. Not because she'd stopped cleaning, because she was allowing herself for just that moment to feel the weight of what she'd done. She thought about her father. She thought about a piece of paper inside a Bible on a shelf in a farmhouse in Colorado. She thought one more promise left. Briggs received the final qualification scores in his office that evening. He sat with them for a long time. Rollins was there. He'd brought them personally, which was not the standard protocol for score delivery, which meant Rollins had done it deliberately to be in the room when Briggs read them. Briggs looked at the numbers. His expression didn't change. His breathing didn't change. She finished first, Rollins said. I can see that, Briggs said. By 11 points. I can see that too. Rollins was quiet for a moment. She went to the canyon last night, he said. After training, stayed 2 hours, alone. Briggs looked up. Watching, Rollins said. Just watching. I could see her on the rim from the ops building. Briggs was quiet. She's going to make that shot tomorrow, Rollins said. He said it not like a prediction and not like a challenge. He said it the way someone states a thing they know to be true and needs another person to know they know it. Briggs set the score sheet down on his desk. The shot is impossible, he said. You've said that, Rollins replied. You've been saying it for 12 years. Because it's true. Rollins looked at his commanding officer. He had served with this man for 11 years. He knew where this came from, not all of it, but enough. He knew about the sister. Not the details, but the shape of it, the way it had left a mark that Briggs carried into every room he entered. Colonel, he said carefully, I think you should watch her shoot tomorrow. Really watch. Not as a commander, not as a grader. As what? Briggs said. Rollins thought about it. As someone who might be wrong, he said quietly. The silence that followed was long. Briggs didn't respond. He picked up the score sheet again and looked at it. His jaw was set at an angle that meant the conversation was over, and Rollins recognized it and left. But the score sheet stayed on the desk, and Briggs looked at it for a long time after Rollins was gone. 11 points. He looked at those numbers the way a man looks at something that is quietly rearranging the furniture of his certainties, and he doesn't like it, and he can't make it stop. The fourth day, the last day, arrived with the particular silence of mornings that know they're going to matter. Claire was awake before the alarm. She lay in the dark for exactly 60 seconds, eyes open, doing nothing except breathing and letting the day arrive. Then she got up, dressed, went through her pre-shoot ritual with her rifle, and walked to the mess for coffee she barely tasted. Tyler was already there. He looked at her over his mug and said, How do you feel? Ready, she said. Just ready. She thought about it. Grateful, she said. I feel grateful. He blinked. Of all the words he'd been expecting, that one hadn't been on the list. For what? He asked. She wrapped both hands around her own mug. For the fact that I get to find out, she said. At 0800, the 17 candidates assembled at the primary firing line. The canyon stretched ahead and below, and 1,400 meters away, invisible to the naked eye, Ghost Target 7 waited exactly where it had been waiting for 32 years. The rules were simple. Each candidate had one shot, one. The instructors were not there to coach. They were there to observe and to confirm if the impossible somehow became possible. Briggs stood slightly apart from the group. He had said nothing to Claire that morning. He had not looked at her differently than he looked at the others. But there was something in the set of his posture that told Rollins, who was watching both of them, that the colonel was bracing for something. The first candidate stepped to the line. He was a ranger named Bosch, composed technically excellent one of the top 5 shooters in the class. He set up, made his environmental assessment, applied his calculations, and fired. Miss, drifted left. The canyon had taken it. Second candidate, another miss. High this time into the cliff face above the target. Third candidate, miss. By the 6th miss, the energy on the line had settled into something heavy and collective. These were not bad shots. These were excellent shots under conditions that were genuinely extreme, and the conditions were winning. Webb was the 9th shooter. He set up with the methodical precision that had characterized everything he did in this program. He spent 45 seconds on his environmental read. He adjusted. He fired. The round hit the canyon wall 12 feet below the target. Webb stood up from his position, looked at the impact point through his spotter scope, and said one word that nobody repeated later, but everyone heard. Then he stepped back and said to Claire, who was standing 2 positions to his left, "The wind in the lower third of the canyon is doing something the flags aren't showing." "I know," she said. He looked at her. Something shifted in his face. "You figured it out," he said, not a question. "I think so," she said. "Last night at the canyon." "Yes." He stared at her for a long moment. "Then go hit it," he said, roughly, directly. The way Marcus Webb said everything that he actually meant. Candidates 10 through 16 shot in sequence. One came close, Kowalski, whose round passed within 2 feet of the target before the canyon claimed it. And then there was one candidate left. Briggs stepped forward. His voice carried across the entire range, across all 17 candidates and all the instructors and the wind that was moving through everything. "No one can make that shot," he said. "Not today, not ever." He looked directly at Claire. "Physics says so." Same words as the day before. Harder this time. Sharper. A last wall erected specifically for her to run into. Claire stepped to the line. She didn't look at Briggs. She didn't look at the other candidates. She didn't look at the instructors or the spotting scopes or the wind flags that had already failed 16 men this morning. She stepped to the firing line, lowered herself into position behind the rifle, and the world, the entire loud, complicated, exhausting world she had been navigating for 6 weeks, went quiet. Not silent. Quiet. The difference mattered. Silence was the absence of sound. Quiet was a choice, a discipline, a room her father had taught her to build inside herself when she was young enough that the lesson had become architecture rather than memory. Rollins moved to the spotting scope behind and to her left. He had spotted for hundreds of candidates on this range over the years. His face behind the eyepiece gave nothing away. But his right hand, resting on his knee, had closed into a loose fist, an unconscious thing. The thing a body does when it's holding tension it hasn't acknowledged yet. Hendricks stood 6 feet to Rollins's right with a clipboard that he wasn't writing on. Briggs stood apart from everyone, 12 feet back from the main instructor, group arms at his sides, watching. The 17 candidates, the 16 who had already shot, and Claire, who hadn't yet arranged themselves in the way soldiers arrange themselves around something significant. Not a formal formation, something more organic. A circle that wasn't quite a circle, people gravitating toward a center, the way they do when they understand that whatever's about to happen is the kind of thing you want to be close to. Tyler Reed was standing near the left edge of the group, and his hands weren't shaking anymore. He had told Claire 3 days ago on the bus that his hands shook from waiting. He wasn't waiting now. He was watching. And the difference between those two things had steadied him completely. Webb stood with his arms crossed and his jaw set and his eyes fixed on the back of Claire's head with an expression that was, if you'd been paying attention to Marcus Webb for 6 weeks, completely unlike anything he'd shown before. It wasn't admiration exactly, though there was some of that. It was something closer to witness the conscious decision to be present and attentive for something that mattered. Claire settled into her position. She did not immediately look through the scope. This was the first thing Rollins noticed, the thing that made his right hand tighten slightly more. Every other candidate had gone straight to the scope. Immediate, instinctive, the way you reach for the thing you trust most when you need information. Claire was looking at the canyon, not through optics, with her eyes, watching. Rollins had been a sniper instructor for 14 years. He had watched more people shoot than he could count. And he had learned over those 14 years to read what a shooter was doing in the seconds before they fired with the same accuracy that a good shooter reads a target. What he saw right now was not someone buying time, was not someone managing nerves, was not someone working through a calculation. What he saw was someone listening. She was watching the canyon the way you watch something you've studied and understand, looking for the specific moment you have been waiting for. Patient but not passive. Alert in a way that had a different quality than urgency, the alertness of someone who has done the difficult work already and is now simply waiting for the right window to apply it. He understood suddenly and completely what she had been doing alone on the canyon rim the previous evening. "What is she doing?" Hendricks said quietly beside him. "Watching," Rollins said. "Watching what?" Rollins didn't answer right away. He was watching too now. He moved his eye to the spotting scope and slowly traversed it across the canyon floor below the target. He was looking for what she was looking for, and after about 20 seconds, he found something, a dust pattern along the canyon bottom, that was doing something he hadn't noticed in 12 years of working this range. Something rotational. "Chief," he said, to himself almost, so quietly that Hendricks had to lean in. "What?" Hendricks said. Rollins was quiet, because what he was seeing was not what the range documentation said the canyon did. And if what he was seeing was accurate, then Claire Donovan had been right last night on that rim, and what she was doing right now was not hope or bravado or the particular kind of stubbornness that makes people attempt impossible things without a real plan. What she was doing was waiting for a cycle. And if she'd counted that cycle correctly, then Colonel Briggs was about to be wrong for the first time in 32 years of being right. Claire pressed her cheek to the stock. The position was perfect, not mechanically perfect. Perfect in the way that reveals when something has moved past technique into instinct. Her body wasn't working to maintain the position. The position simply was. The rifle was an extension of something deeper than muscle. She found the target in the scope. At 1,400 meters, it was small, not impossibly small. She'd been shooting at comparable dimensions, at comparable distances for years. But small, and at this specific range in this specific canyon, with the conditions doing what they were doing, small was a different kind of challenge than it was on an open range under controlled conditions. She took a breath, let it out, found the natural pause at the bottom of the exhale, that still half second between when the lungs empty and when they begin to fill again, the window her father called the quiet moment, the only moment when your body is genuinely at rest. She didn't fire. She let the window pass and took the next breath. Tyler felt the tension in the group ratchet up one notch. A minute had passed since she'd settled into position. That was long, not alarmingly long, not disqualifyingly long, but long enough that some of the candidates were exchanging glances. Webb didn't exchange anything with anyone. He didn't move. Kowalski to Webb's left said in a voice barely above a murmur, "What's she waiting for?" Webb didn't answer. "Seriously," Kowalski said, "what's she Quiet," Webb said. Not harshly, just quiet, like the word itself was a boundary. Kowalski went quiet. Claire was counting. She had started her count from the last dust rotation she'd observed before settling into position. She was at 7. The cycle ran 11 seconds with a half-second variance. At 9 seconds, the rotating thermal pocket in the lower canyon reached its point of maximum angular displacement. From the target line, the moment when the air it was moving was briefly moving parallel to the bullet's path through the critical zone rather than across it. That window lasted approximately 1.5 seconds. In 1.5 seconds, with a bullet traveling at this velocity across this distance, the thermal's influence on the round's path dropped from a variable she couldn't reliably account for to a variable small enough to work within. Her father had told her once, "You don't beat conditions you can't control. You wait for the moment, the conditions give you what you need, and you're ready when they do." She was ready. 8 seconds. She let out the breath she was holding. Slow, controlled, natural. Let it complete. Found the pause. 9 seconds. The air in the canyon shifted. She couldn't see it directly from the firing line, but she felt it, or rather she perceived it, through the accumulated evidence of every indicator she'd been reading since she set up. Dust pattern, heat shimmer behavior. The single hawk that had been circling above the target had stopped circling and was riding a thermal with different characteristics than 30 seconds ago. Her finger touched the trigger. Not pressure, just contact. The beginning of a conversation. 10 seconds. She saw the mirage between herself and the target flatten the heat shimmer that had been undulating in a direction she'd been tracking since she picked up the scope, shifted into the orientation she'd been waiting for. There it was, right there. The window she'd spent 2 hours the night before figuring out how to find. She didn't think. Thinking was for the preparation. This was for the trust. She fired. The rifle moved. The sound cracked across the canyon and then broke apart into echo and came back from both walls simultaneously, a doubled percussion that rolled away into the mountain air. The bullet was already gone, already. Invisible, already somewhere in the 1,400 meters of canyon air between the firing line and Ghost Target 7. Nobody breathed. Rollins was at the spotting scope. He had the target centered. He was watching. 1 second, 1.5 seconds, 2 seconds. The bullet's time of flight at this distance, under these conditions, was approximately 1.8 seconds. Rollins knew this number the way he knew his own name. He was counting it. He was watching the target. At 1.9 seconds, clang. The sound came back from the canyon 2 full seconds after the shot, metal on metal, clean, unmistakable. The sound of a steel target being struck by a round that had traveled exactly where it was sent. For the first time in 32 years, Rollins pulled his eye from the scope. He looked at Hendricks. Hendricks was staring at him with an expression that Rollins had never seen on Hendricks's face, an expression of pure, unguarded, open-mouthed shock. Dead center, Rollins said. His voice was completely flat, completely controlled. Because if he let any of what he was actually feeling into his voice right now, it would come out as something that wasn't appropriate for a chief petty officer on an active training range. Dead center, Hendricks said. Dead center. Behind them, the canyon was still sending back echoes of a sound that nobody present would ever completely forget. And then everything happened at once. Tyler Reed made a sound that wasn't quite a word, something raw and involuntary that came from a place below language. He had his hands on top of his head and was looking at the canyon, and then at Claire, and then at the canyon again. Kowalski said flatly and with complete sincerity, "Holy God." Park made no sound. He simply sat down on the ground where he was standing, as if his legs had made a decision his brain hadn't fully authorized yet. Marcus Webb, who had been the first voice of doubt on day one, who had watched from 3 weeks of neutrality before something had shifted in him, who had come to Rollins with a photograph because he decided that what was right mattered more than what was comfortable. Marcus Webb turned away from the range. He turned away and put his hand over his mouth and stood there for a moment with his back to everything, and nobody looked at him during that moment, which was the right call. Claire was still in position. She hadn't moved. She was still behind the rifle, still at the firing line, still looking through the scope at a steel target 1,400 meters away, that she had just done what 32 years of candidates had been told could not be done. Then slowly she stood up. She stepped back from the firing line. She turned around, and she looked at the faces of the 16 men who were looking at her, and she looked at Rollins, and she looked at Hendricks. And then she looked at Colonel Nathan Briggs. Briggs had not moved. He was standing exactly where he had been standing when he said the words, "Not today, not ever," and he had not moved in the 90 seconds since the sound had come back from the canyon. He was standing with his arms at his sides, and he was looking at Claire with an expression that was doing something complicated and private, and that no one watching would have been able to name with any precision. It was not anger. It was past anger. It was something that anger eventually becomes when it runs out of oxygen. Something raw and less defended. Something that had been underneath the anger the whole time and had been using the anger as a wall. The silence stretched. Webb turned back around. He looked at Briggs. He looked at Claire. He made no move to speak. Rollins cleared his throat. "Confirmed hit," he said, loudly formally the way confirmations get set on a range. "Ghost target 7, round 1, center mass." Nobody cheered. Not immediately. The magnitude of what had just happened was still processing through 17 minds in 17 different ways, and it takes a moment, more than a moment sometimes, for something truly unprecedented to find the right category in a person's brain. It was Tyler who started it. Of course it was Tyler. He started clapping. Single deliberate claps spaced a beat apart. Not a celebration, something more like a standing ovation for a performance that had gone beyond what standing ovations were built for. Kowalski joined him, then Park, then 2 Rangers, then Hendricks, who set his clipboard down and clapped with both hands in a way that suggested he didn't care anymore what was appropriate for an instructor on an active range. Then Webb. Webb's clap was different from the others. It was single, hard, two-handed, the kind of clap that came from someone who had changed their mind about something important over 6 weeks and was acknowledging it without a speech. It built all 17 candidates, both instructors. Briggs stood in the back and didn't clap. But he didn't look away either. He looked at Claire Donovan standing at the firing line of Ghost Target 7, and whatever was happening on his face, it was happening at a depth that hadn't been touched in a very long time. Claire let the sound wash over her for exactly 5 seconds. Then she picked up her rifle, slung it, and walked off the firing line. She walked to a spot 20 feet from the group, far enough for privacy, close enough that she wasn't hiding. She reached into the breast pocket of her uniform. She took out a photograph. It was worn at the edges. A man and a girl, maybe 9 years old, sitting on a hillside in Colorado, the mountains enormous behind them. The man had a spotting scope. The girl was looking through a rifle that was almost as big as she was, and she was grinning. On the back of the photograph in her own handwriting from the night he died was a list. She didn't read it. She didn't need to. She just held the photograph and looked at the man in it, the man who had given her the quiet room, and the patience and the knowledge that wind didn't lie, and that birds told the truth about air, and that impossible was just a word that hadn't met the right preparation yet. She stood there for a long time, long enough that when she finally became aware of her surroundings again, the group had mostly moved back toward the operations building, and the range was beginning to resume the ordinary business of a place that had just witnessed something extraordinary and was slowly returning to itself. Almost everyone had gone. One person hadn't. Colonel Nathan Briggs was standing 10 feet away, and he had been standing there long enough that he had clearly watched her with the photograph, and he hadn't interrupted it, and he wasn't interrupting it now. He was just there, waiting in the awkward and uncharacteristic way of a man who has something he needs to say and doesn't know how to begin. Claire put the photograph back in her pocket. She looked at him. For the first time in 6 weeks, the look between them didn't have a current running through it. No challenge, no pressure, no assessment, just two people standing on opposite sides of something that had just fundamentally changed. Briggs looked at the ground for a moment, then at the canyon, then back at her. His jaw worked once. "How long did you spend up there?" he said finally. "On the rim. Last night." 2 hours, she said. "You found the thermal cycle?" "Yes, sir." He was quiet. "No one has ever done that," he said. "In 32 years, nobody has gone to that rim and watched long enough to find the pattern." She said nothing. "I reviewed the range documentation this morning," he said. "The original design notes from the installation team. They noted the thermal pattern in the design specifications and determined it was too irregular to be used." He paused. "They were wrong." Claire let that sit. "They weren't watching the right things," she said quietly. Briggs looked at her. Something in that answer had landed somewhere. "No," he said after a moment, "they weren't." Another silence. Longer this time. The canyon sent a low sound across the distance, wind moving through rock, the kind of sound that had been happening long before any human came to this valley and would be happening long after. Then Briggs said, "My sister's name was Catherine." Claire went still. She hadn't expected that. She had expected many things from this conversation. An acknowledgement, a formal comment on the shot, possibly a continuation of the war they'd been conducting for 6 weeks in the manner of a carefully managed cessation of hostilities. She had not expected this. She was 26 years old, Briggs continued. His voice was different now. Not flat, not commanding, not the instrument of authority it had been for 6 weeks. It was a voice that had set something down that it had been carrying a long distance. She was trying to become the first woman to complete a special warfare selection pipeline. She was brilliant. She was the best athlete in our family by a mile. Our father called her relentless. He paused. She made it 11 weeks. The pressure, not the physical pressure, the other kind, the social kind, the kind that comes at you from every direction all the time when you are the only one in a room and everyone in the room has decided what you are before you open your mouth. He stopped, collected himself. She had a breakdown during week 12, a serious one. She never came back from it, not completely. Claire was very still. "I have spent 20 years," Briggs said, "believing that protecting women from that pressure was the right thing, that a program like this was that it cost more than it gave back, that my job was to make sure nobody else's Catherine walked through a door that was going to take something from her she couldn't get back." He looked at her directly. "I was wrong," he said. "I was wrong about what protection means. And I was wrong about what it costs when you decide that for someone else." It was the most Claire had ever heard Nathan Briggs say in a single breath that had nothing to do with training or command. She looked at him for a long moment. "I'm sorry about Catherine," she said. "I mean that." He nodded. "I know you do," he said. The wind moved through the canyon again. "Your father was a Marine Scout sniper," Briggs said. "Yes, sir." "He taught you everything you use today." She thought about that. "He taught me how to look," she said. "What I did with it was mine." Briggs held her gaze, and for the first time since she had arrived at his program, Colonel Nathan Briggs, the man who had thrown her file on the floor, who had tampered with her scope, and downgraded her scores and positioned himself between her and every door she tried to walk through. Looked at her without a wall between them. Just a man, just a woman, standing in a canyon where history had just changed by one bullet, one thermal cycle, and 2 hours of patient watching on a cold Nevada rim. "Sergeant Donovan," he said, "Sir, that was the finest single shot I have witnessed in 22 years of this program." She held his gaze. "Thank you, sir," she said. He nodded once, clean and complete. Then he turned and walked back toward the operations building, and his walk was the same as it had always been, the walk of a man who carried authority in his posture without performing it. But something was different. Something in the set of his shoulders had changed by about 3 degrees. Not much, but in the same way that 3 degrees of windage at 1,400 meters was the difference between a miss and dead center. 3 degrees in the posture of a man who had been holding himself against something for 20 years was the difference between closed and open. Rollins was waiting by the operations building door. He had watched the whole thing from 40 feet away. He hadn't pretended not to. When Briggs reached him, Rollins looked at his commanding officer's face and read it the way he read targets, with attention, with experience, with the willingness to accept what he saw rather than what he'd expected to see. What he saw made him exhale slowly through his nose. Not relief exactly. Something more like the feeling of watching something that has been under pressure for a very long time finally find a place to release. "Well," Rollins said. "Don't," Briggs said. "I wasn't going to say anything." "You were going to say I told you so." Rollins considered this. "I was going to say it a lot more diplomatically than that," he said. And Briggs, for the first time in 6 weeks, possibly longer, made a sound that was almost a laugh. It lasted half a second, and then it was gone. But it had been there. The rest of that afternoon moved the way afternoons move after something irreversible has happened. Not slowly, not quickly, but with a different quality of time, the kind where every ordinary moment feels like it's happening inside something larger than itself. The candidates were given 2 hours of administrative downtime after the range evolution, which was standard procedure after the final qualification block. In practice, nobody used that time for administration. They drifted in small groups, finding each other the way people find each other after shared experience, talking without quite being able to say what they were actually talking about, which was the fact that they had all just watched something none of them would forget for the rest of their lives. Tyler found Claire sitting alone on a bench outside the barracks, her rifle case at her feet, the old photograph in her hands again. He sat down beside her without asking permission, which was the right call. Asking would have made it formal. And this wasn't a formal moment. He looked at the photograph. "Your dad," he said. "Yeah," she said. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the man in the picture. The man with the spotting scope and the girl who was grinning behind a rifle almost as big as she was. "He would have loved today," Tyler said. Claire looked at the photograph for a long time. "He did love today," she said quietly. "He just loved it a long time before it happened." Tyler didn't say anything to that. He didn't need to. He just sat with her in the kind of silence that exists between people who have been through something together and don't need to fill the space. After a while, Park came out and sat on the ground nearby, leaning against the building wall. Then Kowalski. Then 2 Rangers whose names were Gutierrez and Hale, and who had barely spoken 10 words to Claire the entire program, but who sat down now with the ease of people who had decided that a previous distance was no longer relevant. Nobody orchestrated it. Nobody announced it. People just kept arriving until there were 9 of them sitting outside that barracks, and the conversation moved the way good conversations move slowly. At first, then with increasing ease, from the day's events to the course overall, to the things people only say when they've stopped performing and started actually talking. Webb was the last to come out. He stood in the doorway for a moment looking at the group, and there was something briefly visible in his face, something that was working out. Whether it was allowed to be here, whether it had earned this, for he walked over and sat down on the far end of the bench, 3 people away from Claire, and nobody acknowledged it and everybody noticed it. After a few minutes of general conversation, Webb said without preamble, not loudly, not directed at anyone in particular, "I said something on day 1 on the grinder, before Briggs came out." The group went slightly quieter. "I said it to Delgado, but you could hear it if you were listening." He paused. "You heard it," he said to Claire. She looked at him, direct. "Yes," she said. "I was wrong," he said, flat, clean, no qualification on it, no cushioning, no explanation that was designed to make the apology easier on himself. Just, I was wrong, the way a serious person admits a serious error. Claire held his gaze for a moment. I know, she said. That's it. He looked almost not offended, but surprised, like he'd prepared for a longer conversation. What else would there be, she said. You were wrong. You figured it out. You did something about it. That's how it's supposed to work. Webb looked at her for another moment. Then he looked away. His jaw was set at the angle that meant he was processing something and giving it the respect it deserved. Your father taught you that too, he said. Everybody taught me that, she said. My father, the army, Afghanistan, you. She paused. People teach you things whether they mean to or not. Park, from his position against the wall, said quietly, What are you going to do next after graduation? They haven't told me yet, Claire said. Whatever they offer you, Park said, say yes. That's the plan, she said. The formal graduation was the following morning. It was held in the operations building's main hall. Not a large space, not a ceremonial space in the grand military tradition, but a functional room that had been arranged with enough chairs and enough formality to communicate that what was happening mattered without overstating it. The families of some candidates had been flown in. There were senior commanders from several branches represented, which was unusual for a program of this classification level, and which communicated something without saying it directly. Rollins told Claire before the ceremony, quietly in the hallway outside, that 3 flag officers had specifically requested to be present for this graduation, not for the graduation in general. He didn't elaborate. He didn't have to. 3, she said. 3, he confirmed. She was quiet for a moment. Because of the shot, she said. The shot traveled fast, he said. These things do. She nodded slowly. Chief, she said. Yeah. Thank you. For the spotting scope on the 1250. For Forsyth, for... She stopped. She was selecting the right words. For watching. Rollins looked at her for a long moment. I have been doing this job for 14 years, he said. In 14 years, I have seen 3 shots that made me stop what I was doing and just look at the target. He paused. Yours was all 3 of the same thing. He walked back into the hall before she could respond, which was probably intentional. The ceremony itself moved briskly and with military efficiency. 17 candidates received their qualifications in sequence. Each name called each commendation, noted each candidate stepping forward with the bearing of someone who understood what they'd earned and didn't need to perform it. When they called Claire's name, the hall went through a subtle but unmistakable change in its own atmosphere. The kind of change that happens when a room that has been collectively holding something decides simultaneously to release it. The senior SEAL commander present, a rear admiral named Greer, who had not spoken publicly during the ceremony up to this point, stood up when Claire stepped forward. He stood up. One person standing when another person is called is a statement. A rear admiral standing is a statement with additional weight. And then because the thing that had happened in that canyon the previous day was the kind of thing that reorients the way people understand what they're watching, Rollins stood up. Hendricks stood up. 2 of the other commanders stood up. The candidates, all 16 of the others, stood up. The family members in the room who didn't entirely understand the full context of what they were witnessing, but understood something significant was happening, stood up. Webb was on his feet before the applause fully started, which was notable to the people who knew where Webb had started this journey. He was standing straight and clapping with both hands, and his face was the face of a man who was proud to be in the room. Tyler Reed, standing at attention in the line of graduates, was not managing to keep his expression fully military. His eyes were bright in a way that had nothing to do with the overhead lighting. Claire stepped forward and received her commendation from Admiral Greer's hands personally, which was also not the standard protocol. He shook her hand and held it for a moment and said something to her that nobody else in the room was close enough to hear. Later, when people asked Tyler what Greer had said, Tyler told them he didn't know. When people asked Webb, Webb said he didn't know either. When people asked Claire herself, she smiled a real smile, the kind that reaches everything, and said, something my father would have agreed with. Nobody pushed further. Some answers are better protected. Then came the moment that nobody had predicted. After the formal portion of the ceremony concluded and the room began to shift into the informal reception that typically followed, Colonel Nathan Briggs crossed the room. He crossed it with intention. Not hurrying, not performing, just moving directly from where he had been standing near the back wall to where Claire was standing with Tyler and Park near the front. The room noticed. The room noticed the way a room notices when something is happening that doesn't have a precedent, not with alarm, but with that particular focused attention that humans give to things they haven't seen before. Briggs stopped in front of Claire. Tyler took a half step back, not out of deference, out of the instinct to give space to something that needed it. Briggs reached into the breast pocket of his uniform jacket and removed a small official envelope. He held it in both hands for a moment, which was not a standard way to hold an envelope, and that non-standard gesture communicated something about the weight he was assigning to it. "This is the official battlefield promotion recommendation," he said. "Signed this morning, my signature. Submitted through proper channels." He paused. "It also includes a personal commendation for the highest individual score in the history of this program." He extended the envelope. Claire took it. "Not as charity," Briggs said. His voice was low enough that it was essentially a private conversation in a room full of people. "Not as politics, not as an acknowledgement of something I was pressured to acknowledge." He held her gaze. "As respect," he said, "earned, shot by shot, over 6 weeks, by a soldier who is better at this than anyone I have trained in 22 years. The room was quiet in a way that was different from the quiet of a formal ceremony. This was the quiet of a room that understood it was inside a moment and was choosing not to interrupt it. Claire looked at the envelope in her hand, then at Briggs. "What changed?" she asked, quietly, directly, the way she asked everything without ornamentation. He was quiet for a moment. "I told you yesterday about Catherine," he said. "Yes." "What I didn't tell you," he said, "is that she asked me 2 weeks before she broke, she asked me whether I thought she belonged there. And I said," he stopped, his jaw tightened once. "I said I didn't know." The silence between them was dense. "I have never forgiven myself for that," he said. "And somewhere between that and now I made it everyone else's problem." He looked at her steadily. "That is not an excuse. It's an explanation. There's a difference." "I know there is," Claire said. "I spent 6 weeks trying to make you quit," he said. "You didn't. And the reason you didn't wasn't stubbornness, and it wasn't pride." He paused. "It was because you had something worth staying for." Claire looked at him for a long time. "So did Catherine," she said gently. Something moved across Briggs's face, fast, private, and very deep. "Yes," he said after a moment. "She did." He straightened. "Congratulations, Sergeant Donovan," he said, "on a shot that 32 years of this program said couldn't be made, and on 6 weeks that I hope you'll allow me to learn from long after you leave this command." He extended his hand. She shook it. His grip was firm and held one beat longer than a formal handshake, and in that one beat was everything that didn't have words. Then he nodded once, turned, and walked back across the room. Webb, who had watched all of it from 8 feet away, let out a breath he had apparently been holding since Briggs had started crossing the room. He looked at Claire. He raised an eyebrow. She looked back at him. "Close your mouth," she said. He closed it. "Was that," he started. "Yes," she said. "Did he just—" "Yes." Webb looked at the back of Briggs's retreating figure. "Huh," he said, which for Marcus Webb was an entire speech. That night after the reception and the administrative processing and the conversations that happen at the end of long, hard things when people are figuring out how to say goodbye without making it too large, Claire went back to the barracks alone. She sat on the edge of her rack in the empty room. The others were still in the common areas, wringing the last hours out of a shared experience that was ending, and she took the photograph out of her breast pocket one more time. She held it in both hands and looked at it for a long time. The man with the spotting scope, the girl with the grin, Colorado mountains behind them that had been there before either of them was born and would be there long after both of them were gone. She thought about the quiet room he had built inside her. She thought about the deer blind at 8 years old learning that silence was information. She thought about the way he had described Wynn not as a problem to solve, but as a truth to read. She thought about his hands, which had been a sniper's hands, steady and precise, and which had at the end been too thin in hers when she held them. She thought about that last night. The chair by the window, the mountains in the distance, catching the last light. His voice mostly breath by then, "You already know everything I taught you. Now you just have to trust it." She had trusted it. She had trusted it through a tampered scope and false accusations and downgraded scores and 6 weeks of a man using his authority to try to make her disappear. She had trusted it on a canyon rim in the cold Nevada evening, counting thermal cycles in the dust. She had trusted it at the firing line with 16 failed shots before her and a steel target that 32 years of elite shooters had been told was beyond what physics allowed. She had trusted it, and it had held. She reached into her kit and found the small journal she had carried since her father's funeral. She opened it to the page she had opened it to 1,000 times over the years. His handwriting from the Bible transcribed in her own hand on the night she buried him. Claire's promises. Serve with honor. Never quit. Become the sniper they said you couldn't be. She read each one. She had read them in tents in Afghanistan, in forward operating bases in Iraq, in barracks and vehicles, and on long flights in the dark. She had read them when she was so tired she couldn't think clearly, and when she was afraid in ways she never showed anyone, and when the world seemed arranged specifically to make her fail. She took a pen from her jacket pocket. She held it over the third line for a moment. Then she drew a single check mark next to it. She sat with that for a very long time. Sat with the completed list and the photograph of the man who had written it in the canyon somewhere in the dark outside where a steel target had finally stopped waiting. She didn't cry immediately. She sat with it, first sat with the fullness of it, the weight and the relief and the grief and the gratitude. All of it occupying the same space at the same time, the way large feelings do when you stop managing them. Then she cried. Not loudly, not dramatically. In the way that private grief looks quiet and complete, the body releasing something it has been holding through 6 weeks and 34 years, and every promise ever made in a dimly lit room to a man whose hands were too thin and whose voice was mostly breath. She cried for her father. She cried for Catherine Briggs, who had asked the wrong person whether she belonged and received the wrong answer. She cried for every woman who had stood at a door and been told by the architecture of the room that the door wasn't hers. She cried for the girl in the photograph grinning behind a rifle almost as big as she was, who had no idea yet what the world was going to ask of her, but who had a father beside her with a spotting scope pointing at the distance, teaching her to read what was really there. When she was done, she closed the journal. She put the photograph back in her breast pocket close to where her heart was. She sat up straight. She breathed. And in that small room at the end of the longest 6 weeks of her life, Sergeant First Class Claire Donovan, combat veteran, Purple Heart recipient, the highest scoring graduate in the history of the SEAL Advanced Sniper course, made one more decision. Not a promise. She was done with promises. She had kept all of them. A decision. She decided that what had happened in that canyon was not the end of something. It was the beginning of something. Not for her career, not for her record, not for the commendation in the envelope in her kit, though all of those things were real and mattered. For every soldier who came after her. For every woman who would stand on a grinder at Coronado and feel a room decide what she was before she opened her mouth. For every Tyler Reed who needed someone to explain the difference between controlling a breath and fighting one. For every person who had been told that physics said so, that the distance was too great, the conditions too complex, the target too small, and had almost believed it. She thought about what her father had said once sitting on that Colorado hillside when she was 12 years old and frustrated that a shot she'd been practicing for a week still wasn't consistent. He had put his hand on her shoulder and said, "Claire, great shooters hit targets, but that's not what this is really about." She had looked at him. "What's it about?" she'd asked. He had looked at the mountains. "Great warriors," he said, "change what people believe is possible." She had been 12 years old and hadn't fully understood it. She understood it now. In the years that followed, every woman who entered the SEAL sniper pipeline heard the story before they fired their first shot at the qualification range. The instructors told it, yes, but more often it was the candidates who'd been there who told it. Webb told it at every leadership event he attended for the next decade, with the directness he brought to everything and the specific credibility of a man who had started out on the wrong side of it and said so plainly. Tyler told it in the way people tell stories that change them, not as history, but as something still alive. Park told it quietly to people who needed to hear it privately in the moments before something difficult. And always the story ended the same way. A woman, a canyon, a steel target that 32 years of impossibility had been building to. An 11-second thermal cycle that nobody had bothered to watch long enough to find. One round, one breath. Dead center. The story ended there. But the thing the story left behind was larger than the story and longer, and it didn't end when the telling did. Because the shot that Claire Donovan fired on that cold Nevada morning didn't just travel 1,400 meters through a canyon wind that everyone had agreed was unreadable. It traveled forward. Through every qualification class that came after, through every woman who stood at a firing line and heard that story and understood what it meant. Not that the shot was easy, not that the conditions were fair, not that the people in the room had been ready to believe in her before she proved them wrong. But that ready didn't matter. That the work her father had done in her sitting on a hillside in Colorado, pointing at distances that seemed too far, had a reach that extended past him and past her, and into something that didn't have a ceiling yet. The canyon still stands in Nevada. The steel target still hangs at 1,400 meters between two walls of rock that the mountains built over millions of years. The thermal cycle still rotates every 11 seconds, patient and indifferent to the people who come to the rim and watch or don't watch, understand or don't understand. And Ghost Target 7, which held its silence for 32 years against 800 attempts, now holds a different kind of history in its steel. The kind that rings out across a valley, the kind you can still hear if you're listening, the kind a father taught his daughter to hear on a hillside in Colorado before the world had any idea what she was becoming.